She said it like she was canceling a subscription. No apology, no hesitation, just a flat decision delivered mid-scroll, like my life had been reduced to background noise. You're too old to babysit my kids. That was it. That was the sentence. I stood in her kitchen, still holding the towel I'd used to dry the lunch plates, the ones I'd chosen specifically because Ella liked the ones with blue trim. I had just folded the baby clothes, warmed the soup, wiped the counters, and still she didn't look up when she said it. My daughter, Danica, the same girl who once cried if I left the room, the same child I raised through job loss, teenage heartbreaks, college tuition, and the messy unraveling of her father's absence. The same daughter who once leaned on my shoulder and whispered, "Don't ever leave me." She left me first, quietly, gradually, by erasing, not by shouting. That sentence, though, it made the quiet visible. "We just feel like it's time to make a shift," she added, as if parenting were a startup and I'd aged out of relevance. Her tone didn't carry anger, which might have been easier to respond to. It was the calm, professional coldness of someone who didn't need to see your reaction, and I gave her none. I smiled, nodded, said I understood, because that's what mothers do, even when the words land like glass in the chest. I walked back to the guest room, once described as your space, Mom, but now clearly just borrowed square footage. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the pale carpet, worn soft from years of late-night pacing when the kids had fevers, or when Danica came home crying from another failed deal. And I wondered, when had I stopped being part of the family and started being part of the furniture? It wasn't rage I felt, not even sadness, really. It was something harder to name. A thinning, a hollowing, like I had been slowly emptied out, gesture by gesture, until I was a shape that could be stepped around but not seen. Danica didn't hate me. She didn't even dislike me. That might have meant I mattered enough to stir emotion. What I felt from her was something deeper than resentment. I felt indifference, and that broke something in me I hadn't realized could still be touched. That night I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The baby monitor hummed softly beside me, Ella's breathing still steady and small. I didn't turn it off. I couldn't yet. It reminded me of who I had been just hours earlier, the woman who still tucked someone in, the woman who still mattered. But apparently, that wasn't enough anymore. I closed my eyes, and the words repeated like a whisper behind my eyelids. "You're too old to help." But I said nothing. I didn't pack. I didn't protest. I simply stayed very still in the dark, listening to the quiet between breaths, because sometimes the deepest shift doesn't come with thunder, it comes with silence. And that night, something began to move in me, slow and final. Something had ended. I just didn't know yet what would begin in its place. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment when I stopped being part of the rhythm of the house. It was more like a gradual drift, the way furniture collects dust when no one sits there anymore. I still woke early, still brewed my coffee with the same vanilla bean blend Alan used to love, still folded Noah's socks in neat pairs, but the sense of being seen, of being part of something larger than my own small routines, had begun to slip through my hands. At first, I told myself it was just a busy season. Danica had listings to manage, the kids were growing fast, schedules changed, but there were signs, small at first, then impossible to ignore. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and saw a new digital tablet mounted where the corkboard used to be. The corkboard had been our shared command center. School reminders, grocery notes, appointment times, all scribbled in different colors. I reached up to touch the new screen, curious, and asked Danica if she could show me how it worked. She didn't look up from her laptop. "We've got it now." Just that, not unkind, just closed. Then came the nanny. Risa was young, bright, and confident. She arrived on a Tuesday without warning. I came downstairs to find her helping Ella build a puzzle. Danica passed through the kitchen and said she forgot to tell me they'd hired someone to give me a little break. A break from what, she didn't say. I smiled. I always smiled. That was my role. Keep the peace. Don't ask too many questions. I tried to be helpful. I offered to explain Ella's bedtime routine, the song she liked, sung only halfway, the way she asked for the light to be dimmed to a certain level. Danica cut me off before I could finish. She's a professional, Mom. That was it. Not cruel, just conclusive. I stepped back. I told myself this was fine, that I could rest more, that I'd been doing a lot. But rest isn't peace when it's forced. It's absence. The days became quieter. I no longer heard my name called from the hallway. I no longer picked up the children from school. I stopped receiving texts about what was needed from the store or how Ella's cold had progressed. Even the children sensed the change. Ella still hugged me, still smiled when she saw me, but her routines no longer revolved around me. She reached for Risa when she wanted juice. Noah showed his art projects to Danica first. I had not been excluded with malice, but I had been gently, thoroughly moved aside. Evening shifted too. I used to set the table for dinner, always for 4. One evening I did just that, only for Danica to inform me they were eating out, with Risa joining. "You don't have to wait up," she said, as she adjusted her earrings. I stood there holding a plate, unsure whether to put it down or keep setting the rest. That was the first time I felt truly out of place in my daughter's home. I still cleaned. I still organized. I rearranged the spice drawer one afternoon just to feel some control over space. But the home didn't need me anymore. I became the quiet presence in the background. The laundry folded itself. The lunches packed themselves. The morning chaos moved forward whether I was in the room or not. I was still under their roof, but no longer inside their lives. It was not a rupture. It was erosion. And erosion, I've learned, is more dangerous than any storm because you don't notice what's being taken until you're standing in silence, trying to remember what it felt like to be necessary. There's a difference between being in a house and being part of a home. I had lived in Danica's house for nearly 3 years, but somewhere in that last winter, I stopped feeling like a thread in the fabric. I became something else, still present, still polite, still useful in small ways, but no longer essential. The rhythm no longer waited for me to catch up. It moved around me, fast and efficient, like a system that had learned how to run without its original parts. The day I knew for certain came quietly. I had kept Ella home from preschool that morning. Her nose was runny and her cheeks flushed with warmth. She had curled into me, her head on my shoulder, a book balanced between us, her little body still and trusting. It was one of the rare moments where I still felt like someone's center. As I read to her, I wasn't watching the clock or worrying about my place in the house. I was just holding a child who still saw me. Danica came home early and found us like that. She didn't ask how Ella was. She didn't even pause. She glanced at the time and said we were ruining the nap schedule again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even sound upset. She just delivered the sentence like a correction, like something that needed fixing. Then she walked away. I looked down at Ella, her eyes half closed, her small fingers still tangled in the hem of my sweater, and I felt something inside me slip. Later that night, I overheard her talking to Liam. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was folding laundry in the hallway when their voices drifted in from the kitchen. She said I meant well, that I was trying, but I was starting to forget things, that she thought I might be too old to really help anymore. The words settled over me like dust. Not because they were cruel, but because they were said with the kind of kindness that erases. I stopped offering after that. I didn't ask about school pickups or bedtime routines. I didn't offer suggestions when Ella had another cold or when Noah forgot his jacket. I simply observed. I watched how Danica stopped including me in the small things. Conversations about weekend plans, updates from school, the little stories that once landed on the kitchen counter between bites of toast. I had become the one who waited for news, rather than the one it came to first. The strange part was that I kept trying to be helpful, out of habit, out of love, out of fear that if I stopped, I would disappear entirely. I folded the towels even straighter. I made sure the dishwasher was always emptied. I restocked the hand soap before it ran out. No one asked me to. No one noticed when I did. But it made me feel like I still had a place to stand. Then came the day of the barbecue. Danica was hosting her colleagues, young couples in linen dresses, sipping chilled wine, making conversation that sounded more like audition tapes than real connection. I stayed inside, chopping fruit the way I always had. It wasn't a task I had been asked to do, but it gave me something to hold on to. When I stepped outside with the tray, laughter floated through the air like perfume. I set the bowl on the table and turned to go back inside, but I heard her voice. She was talking to two other women, both sharply dressed and effortlessly confident. She gestured toward me and said, laughing, that I still brought fruit salad to every event, like it was the 1990s. The women laughed politely. One of them gave me a quick, tight smile when our eyes met. That was when I felt it, not sadness, not shame, but a clean, slicing kind of realization. I wasn't a person in her story anymore. I was a punchline. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for an explanation. I went back inside and sat on the edge of my bed, the tray of sliced melon still wet with condensation. I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand, Danica holding newborn Noah, me beside her, glowing with pride. That version of me had believed in forever, believed that love was enough, believed that being present would always mean being valued. But love, I was learning, could be conditional, and presence could be mistaken for convenience. That night, I turned off the baby monitor for the first time since I moved in. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed to hear what I wasn't part of. I sat in the dark and let the quiet settle around me like a blanket. It was cold, but it was honest, and sometimes honesty is the only warmth left. There was no argument, just a quiet afternoon, soft winter light coming through the window, and Danica sitting across from me with her hands folded in her lap. She began by thanking me for my help, for being there for the kids, for always stepping in. It was the kind of preface you give before shifting the ground under someone. She said they thought it was time for me to have something of my own, a place where I could rest, maybe something quieter. The phrasing was careful, so careful it almost sounded like a gift. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. I nodded when she said there was a new complex near Birch Street that had an opening. She said it had garden space. She remembered I used to love my herbs. I said that sounded nice. I didn't ask who had decided it was time. I already knew. When she finished, she looked relieved. She touched my arm and said, "This will be good for us." She meant well. I suppose that made it harder. I didn't cry. I didn't ask for more time. I made arrangements that evening, found a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, clean but small. I packed quietly. I kept only what I could carry and left the rest folded neatly in the guest room closet. I didn't tell the children. I assumed Danica would, in her own way. On my last morning in the house, the sun was low and the kitchen smelled faintly of toast. I left a note on the counter, not because anyone asked for one, but because I had always said goodbye. I paused for a moment at the bottom of the stairs, listening for footsteps. There were none. I left the house the way I had lived in it the last few months, unnoticed. The new apartment had no garden. The windows faced a concrete lot. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at the empty shelves, the scuffed floor, the way sound echoed slightly in the corners. It was nothing like the home I had built for Danica, nothing like the warmth I had wrapped around her when she was small, but it was mine, if only by process of elimination. The silence wasn't kind. It pressed in from every side. I missed the soft chaos of children. I missed Ella's sleepy breath on my shoulder. I missed the way Noah ran down the hall, calling for me. I missed even the small, unspoken roles, refilling the soap, folding laundry, restocking cereal. They had filled my days with purpose, even if no one had said thank you, but in the quiet, something stirred. Not anger, not even grief, just a thin outline of space I hadn't seen before. A space where no one interrupted, where no one redirected, where I could exist without asking permission. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was the beginning of distance, and sometimes distance is what lets you breathe. The apartment above the laundromat smelled faintly of detergent and something older, like warm metal or forgotten heat. The stairs creaked in familiar tones, not unlike the hallway floors of my childhood home. There was only one window in the living room, overlooking a back alley with power lines stretching across like taut string. It wasn't beautiful, but it was quiet. That first week, I barely unpacked. I folded a few clothes into the drawers, laid a thin blanket over the bed, and stood in the silence longer than I sat. No one called. I knew they were busy. School mornings, ballet rehearsals, Danica's work dinners, Liam's conferences. I repeated that list often in my head, like a script meant to make sense of the emptiness. But the truth is, I had never expected silence to feel so heavy. Not loud, not cruel, just final. I stopped reaching for my phone after the second night. It didn't ring, it didn't vibrate. It just lay there on the counter, waiting for a voice that wouldn't come. I tried to fill the hours. I walked to the small park 3 blocks down, where the benches were always half-shaded and the pigeons predictable. I brought stale bread once, not for the birds, but because it gave me a reason to be there. I smiled at strangers. Some smiled back, others didn't. I found a corner cafe with chipped mugs and a waitress who spoke gently. I ordered tea just to hear my name said aloud. I thought I would feel freer being on my own. I thought there would be something invigorating about not being needed. But freedom, at first, looks a lot like being forgotten. I missed my granddaughter's questions. I missed packing lunches. I missed the way Noah would hand me his drawings with such urgency, as if the paper might vanish if I didn't see it quickly enough. But in that missing, something else was quietly growing. I began reading again, not in snippets between chores, but whole chapters at a time. I found a used bookstore down an alley with an old cat that slept on the register. I bought novels I hadn't touched in years, stories that had once filled the edges of my youth. I started cooking meals for myself, simple ones at first, then more complicated as the days passed. I plated them with care. I sat at the table and ate slowly, not to delay the end, but to experience the moment. I didn't talk about Danica, not to the waitress, not to the old man at the park who fed birds without looking at them, not even to myself in the quietest hour of the night. I wasn't ready to say her name in past tense. I wasn't ready to admit I had become optional. One evening, I stood in the window and watched the laundromat lights flicker. A young woman was pulling clothes from a dryer, her toddler spinning in circles near her feet. She looked tired, not defeated, just carrying too much. I watched her lift the child, kiss the top of his head, and whisper something that made him giggle. My chest tightened. That used to be my world. The noise, the mess, the small hands pulling on my sleeve. And then, just like that, it had ended. Not with a crash, but a closing door. But endings have their own language. They speak in empty chairs, in quiet forks against plates, in the creak of stairs at dusk. And in that language, I was slowly learning to answer. Not with bitterness, not with pleading, but with something quieter. A recognition. I had loved fully. I had been present. And now I was no longer part of that chapter, but I was still here, still capable of building something new, even if no one would see it from the outside. I hadn't bought it out of hope. It was an afterthought. A small rectangle of paper I picked up with a loaf of bread and a roll of paper towels. The clerk asked if I wanted a quick pick, and I nodded, barely listening. I slipped it into my wallet without looking at the numbers. Weeks passed. I forgot it was there. That winter was long. Rain collected at the corners of my windows, and the walls held a chill that no amount of tea could warm. I began sleeping with socks on, something I used to tease my mother for doing. I watched the world move from my window, one bus at a time. I sometimes counted the seconds between their arrivals, as if timing other people's routines could anchor my own. I cleaned my drawers one Sunday, not because they needed it, but because something in me wanted order. I found the ticket tucked beneath old receipts and a grocery list. I almost threw it away. But my hands paused. The numbers printed on it were still crisp, the ink unblurred. I set it on the counter and brewed another cup of tea, unsure why I hadn't let it go. That evening, I searched the draw results. It took longer than expected. I entered the numbers carefully, twice, then 3 times. The screen didn't flash or sing, just a quiet line of text. Jackpot winner, 1 ticket. My numbers. I stared at them, read them again. I waited for doubt, for skepticism, but the moment was still. Not ecstatic, not explosive, just quiet and complete. I didn't call anyone. I didn't run out into the hallway or scream into a pillow. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the steam rise from my cup. It felt less like luck and more like punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence that had taken too long to write. For years, I had given everything I had, my time, my care, my presence. And now, without warning, something had been given back. The days after were strange. I didn't rush to claim the prize. I moved slowly, like someone trying not to startle a delicate balance. I went to the grocery store. I folded my laundry. I still returned library books on time. But underneath everything was the quiet hum of change. I made an appointment, not in the city, but in the next town over. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel anchored. The clerk at the office was polite, her eyes flicking from me to the numbers, back again. She congratulated me. I nodded. The check was processed. The amount, almost abstract, felt like it belonged to someone else, but I was very much real. And I knew, without question, that no one else would know about it. Not Danica, not the children, not anyone from that life. This wasn't a ticket out of loneliness. It wasn't revenge wrapped in gold leaf. It was something rarer than both. It was a reset, written not in apology, but in silence. I took the long way home that afternoon, walked past the lake, watched a boy skip stones across the surface. His laughter echoed off the water, light and sharp. I used to know that sound in my own home. But this was not about going back. It was about choosing what comes next without having to ask for permission. The money didn't change how I slept, but it changed the shape of my thoughts. I began making lists, not for chores, but for possibilities, places I wanted to see, meals I had never tasted, books I had always meant to read in their original language. I pulled out a worn map from the back of my closet, not to track a route, but to remember the world was still wide. The ticket stayed in my drawer for 3 more weeks, folded once, then once again, until I was ready not just to hold it, but to use it. I didn't pack all at once. It began with small things: a passport from the back of a drawer, a pair of walking shoes I hadn't worn in years, a soft scarf I once wore every autumn before the children were born. Each item moved from the shelf to the suitcase without noise. I folded my life slowly, piece by piece, in the silence of early mornings. The laundromat buzzed below me, a gentle reminder that life kept tumbling forward even when no one watched. There was no announcement, no farewell dinner, no last-minute hugs. I didn't write a letter. I didn't send a message. I simply stopped waiting. I had lived in waiting too long, waiting to be asked, to be invited, to be remembered. This time, I allowed myself the dignity of slipping out without explanation. I closed my bank accounts. I handed in the apartment keys to the woman downstairs who barely remembered my name. I left the fridge empty and the windows clean. It felt right to leave the space as untouched as I had been. I walked out with one suitcase and one bag. I didn't look back at the door. There was nothing behind it I hadn't already carried alone. The airport was quiet. Like most early morning places, I moved through it unnoticed, another gray-haired woman boarding a flight without fanfare. The clerk at the gate called my name softly, as if it belonged to someone fading into a new outline. The plane took off into clouds that didn't ask where I had been. I stared out the window and let the sky stretch wide. The hotel I chose was in a small coastal town where no one knew my face. The streets curved gently, lined with shuttered windows and pale blue doors. There was salt in the air and something looser in my chest. I walked without hurry. I ate breakfast alone, not because I had no one to join me, but because I had begun to enjoy the stillness of solitude, unmeasured by usefulness. Somewhere between the third and fourth day, I realized I hadn't checked my phone once, not for missed calls, not for photos, not for signs that someone had noticed. That silence, once heavy, had become breathable. I was no longer waiting to be pulled back in. I bought notebooks. I filled the first few pages with lists of places, of names, of scents I wanted to chase. I watched the sea change color with the hour. I drank coffee that tasted like the kind I once made for Danica before her meetings. But this time, I drank it hot all the way through. No one asked where I had come from. The woman at the bakery remembered my order by the fourth visit. A child smiled at me in the square and tugged at his mother's sleeve when I waved back. I was no one to them. And yet, in that anonymity, I was beginning to feel whole. I didn't speak Danica's name. Not aloud, not in my thoughts. I didn't rehearse what I would say if she ever called. I didn't wonder if the children missed me. There was nothing more I owed to that version of myself, the woman who folded herself small enough to fit where she wasn't wanted. Now, when I walked past mirrors, I paused, not to inspect, not to correct, but to see. I was still here. Wrinkled, yes, weathered perhaps, but steady. My story hadn't ended. It had just changed languages, and I was learning, finally, how to speak it. The morning of my birthday arrived, with the sound of gulls outside the window and the soft clatter of bicycles passing below. I opened the curtains slowly, letting the light find its way across the small room I had come to love. There were no streamers, no half-wrapped gifts hidden by small hands, no cake cooling on the counter, just light and the quiet rhythm of a town that didn't know my name. It had been 1 year since I left without a word, 1 year since I had last heard my daughter's voice. I thought that would hurt more than it did. But pain changes shape over time. It softens in places you don't expect. And sometimes what replaces it isn't happiness, but clarity. I bought myself flowers from the market, pale yellow tulips with edges like folded sunlight. I chose a small table at the cafe by the square and ordered the tart I always admired but never bought. The woman behind the counter lit a tiny candle without asking and placed it beside the plate. She didn't know it was my birthday. Maybe she sensed something. Maybe it was just habit, but the gesture landed gently. I smiled, not because I felt young or celebrated, but because I didn't need anyone else to mark the day for me. Later, I walked along the shoreline, my hands deep in the pockets of the coat I'd bought the week before. It was warmer than expected, and the waves lapped with a kind of patient consistency. I passed couples walking hand in hand, tourists taking photos, children daring the tide. I walked without urgency, without direction, just a quiet step after a step that felt like breathing. There was a bench not far from the rocks where an old man sat every morning with a thermos and a newspaper. Today, he wasn't there. I sat anyway. I pulled out a postcard I'd been carrying for weeks. It showed a watercolor of the harbor, soft tones and open sky. On the back, I wrote one sentence: "I'm well." No name, no return address, no invitation to reply. I left it unsealed and slipped it into my bag. I didn't know if I would send it. I didn't know if it mattered. But something about writing it, about reducing everything I had become into those two quiet words, felt like a kind of release. As the sky dimmed, I returned to the small room that smelled faintly of cedar and linen. I set the tulips in a jar by the window and opened the bottle of wine I'd saved for no particular occasion. I poured one glass. I toasted nothing in particular. And I sat in the fading light of my birthday, feeling something that surprised me, not joy, not sorrow, just peace. Not a single call came from home, not a message, not a forgotten note from the kids. I didn't check the phone after the second hour. I didn't wait by the door. I had already stopped expecting the sound of my name from voices that had once needed me. Instead, I wrote a paragraph, then another, not about the past, but about the view from the hilltop I'd climbed last week, about the way the sea curved against the rocks, about the small cat that followed me halfway home. I wrote like I used to before marriage, before motherhood, before being someone else's structure. The pages didn't ache, they stretched. And in them, I began to glimpse a self I had long put aside. It was not the birthday I would have imagined years ago, but it was the first one I had ever spent entirely on my own terms. No expectation, no obligation, just presence. And that, I realized, was the gift. It was a Tuesday when the message came. I hadn't been waiting for it. That part of me had gone quiet a long time ago. I was coming back from the morning market, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper, a small wedge of cheese tucked in my coat pocket. The air still carried the crispness of early spring. I climbed the stairs slowly, not because I was tired, but because I had learned the rhythm of slowness, how it lets you notice things like the scent of citrus from the bakery or the way a shutter creaks when the wind changes. When I reached my door, I saw the envelope. It wasn't thick, just a single sheet inside, addressed to me in handwriting I hadn't seen in over a year. The name on the corner, Danica's, sat still on the paper like something unsure of itself. I didn't open it right away. I placed the bread on the counter, removed my coat, put the kettle on. Some silences aren't broken by urgency. I opened it at the table with both hands, smoothing the fold carefully. Her words were neat, as always, polite, too polite. She asked how I was. She hoped I was safe, warm, cared for. She said the children asked about me. She didn't say when. She didn't say how often. She said she regretted how things had unfolded. That time had given her perspective. That she saw now how she had expected too much and given too little. That maybe I could find it in myself to reconnect. There was no mention of my birthday, no mention of the months that had gone by in silence, No real explanation, just soft phrases wrapped in caution. I read the letter twice, not because I needed to absorb it, but because I wanted to feel something, but I didn't. Not sorrow, not relief, just a distant quiet, the kind that comes when you're too far from the shore to hear waves anymore. I folded the letter and set it inside a drawer I rarely used, not out of anger, not as a rejection, just as an acknowledgement that it belonged to a time I had already walked beyond. I didn't write back. I didn't tell anyone I had received it. Some things, once broken, don't shatter loudly. They simply fall apart until there's nothing left to fix. That evening, I walked to the cliffs above the harbor. The sky opened into a soft blue, the kind that made you forget what day it was. I sat on the stone wall and let my hands rest on my lap. I had imagined once that if she ever reached out, I'd feel a rush of something, validation maybe, or longing. But I had built a life without that tether. I had learned to stand without applause. And now her words felt like echoes in a room I no longer lived in. I still loved her. That hadn't changed. But love, I had learned, didn't always mean returning. Sometimes it meant letting things stay behind you where they belonged. Sometimes it meant protecting what you had rebuilt from the very thing that once made you crumble. As the sun dipped low, I stood and walked back slowly through the narrow streets. I passed a small boy kicking a ball against a wall, a woman watering plants on her balcony, an old man dozing on a bench. No one knew who I had been. No one expected anything from me. And in that space, I was free. I slept well that night, not because the letter meant closure, but because I hadn't needed it to feel whole. They arrived in the town one weekend in July, unannounced. I saw them from the bakery window while reaching for a jar of marmalade. Danica stood near the fountain, scanning the square. The children had grown, Noah taller, his shoulders edged with adolescence, and Grace no longer tugging at hands, but walking on her own, arms crossed in quiet defiance. They looked out of place, like actors stepping onto the wrong stage. The sun caught the edge of her sunglasses as she turned, and I stepped back, uncertain whether she had seen me. I didn't leave the bakery right away. I let the moment settle around me, watched her gesture toward the cafe across the street, the one I often sat in during quiet afternoons. They didn't go in. They moved toward the harbor instead, Danica leading, the children trailing. Their movements had a hesitation I recognized. It was the way people walk when they're not sure what they're hoping to find. Later that day, I passed them again by the cliff path. They were looking out at the sea, backs turned, the wind pulling softly at their clothes. I slowed but didn't stop. They didn't look behind. There was no recognition, just three figures framed by coastline and distance. It should have felt surreal to stand within steps of people who once formed the axis of my world and feel like a stranger passing through. But it didn't. It felt honest. Time had done what time always does. It had erased outlines, softened voices, changed the temperature of memory. I returned home and found a note slid under my door. No name, just 2 sentences. We're here. We'd like to see you. I folded the paper in half and set it beside the fruit bowl. I made tea. I watched the steam rise and curl. I didn't rush to answer. That evening, I sat in the square alone. The streetlights flickered on slowly, catching the edges of the cobblestones. A couple danced to a song playing from a nearby window. It wasn't a special night, but it was mine. I had built something here. Not loud, not large, but steady. And I realized, with a clarity I hadn't known I needed, that their presence didn't change it. The next morning, I saw them again at the market. Danica looked tired in a way I recognized from years ago, when the children were young and her life was always 2 steps behind her expectations. She held a basket too tightly. Noah saw me first. His eyes caught mine and lingered. He looked at his mother, then back. But he said nothing. Neither did I. I walked past them, nodding politely at the vendor. I paid for my olives and left without turning around. Some ties don't need to be cut. They unravel on their own, thread by thread, until the fabric no longer holds. And when you finally let the last thread fall, it doesn't snap, it floats. I didn't check my door for another note. I didn't walk the harbor again that weekend. I stayed home, wrote a few lines in my notebook, watered the rosemary plant on the balcony, watched the light slide across the floor as the afternoon passed. The family I once belonged to had come looking for someone they remembered, but she didn't live here anymore, and I had no interest in waking her up. When I left my old life, I didn't bring much. No family heirlooms, no photographs framed in silver. I took a scarf that once smelled faintly of lavender, though that faded months ago. I carried a wooden spoon worn smooth at the handle, not for sentiment, but because it fit my hand just right. And I brought a thin stack of letters my mother had written me long before her memory began to fray. Everything else I left behind, not because I wanted to forget, but because it weighed more than it gave. People talk about freedom as though it comes with wings, but for me, it arrived quietly. It came in the form of empty drawers, of choosing where to place my cup in the cabinet, of not hearing my name unless I chose to speak it. The absence of noise was not silence. It was space. I kept to routines not out of obligation, but comfort. I walked the same path each morning, past the bookstore with the handwritten signs, past the crooked bench near the fountain, past the tailor who never smiled but always nodded. These small recognitions became my scaffolding. I didn't need to be known deeply anymore. I just needed to be seen in passing and left in peace. I often wondered what Danica had expected when she came. A reunion softened by time, a mother willing to fold herself again into a place she had been asked to disappear from. Or perhaps she imagined I had waited, that the version of me she had grown used to, the one who adjusted, apologized, accommodated, had survived the leaving. But she had mistaken absence for pause. I hadn't been waiting. I had been rebuilding. There are things I miss, of course. The weight of Grace asleep against my shoulder on the train. The smell of burnt toast in the mornings when Noah insisted on making breakfast. The sound of the front door opening after school. But I don't miss who I was in those moments. How I filtered myself through usefulness. How I carried love like a ledger, always calculating if I'd given too much or not enough. Now I write letters I never send. To myself, to my mother, to the girl I used to be, before I became someone's mother, someone's keeper. I tuck them into a box beside my bed, not because I want them found, but because writing them reminds me that the story continued, that it didn't stop when I was told I was too old. It simply changed chapters. I've learned to sit with quiet without rushing to fill it. I've learned the pleasure of a meal prepared slowly, of a book reread aloud, of a day spent without plans. I've learned that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. And I've learned that forgiveness, when it comes, doesn't need an audience. What I took with me wasn't measured in things. It was in the decision to belong to myself again. The offer came in late autumn, folded into a formal envelope with embossed lettering. A retirement community just outside the city had a wait list, but they were making space for family. Danica enclosed a note, brief but warm. She mentioned my old room, the garden out back, how the children would love to visit. There was a photo tucked inside, Noah smiling with braces gone, Grace holding a violin. They looked older, as they should. They looked like children I used to know. I read the letter by the window, the afternoon light sliding in, thin through the shutters. Outside, the trees had turned amber and brittle, and the air carried the first signs of winter. I set the envelope down and boiled water for tea. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. Later that day, I walked to the coast, the way I always did when decisions stirred. The tide was lower than usual, and the rocks were dark with moss. I sat at the edge of the wall, coat zipped high, hands in my lap. In the distance, the lighthouse blinked steady, a rhythm I'd come to trust. It would have been easy, in another life, to take her up on the offer, to fold myself into a system that now had room for me again, to nod politely at neighbors, to sit on benches and listen to the same stories on repeat, to become someone's mother again, someone's guest, someone's occasional obligation. But I had spent too long shrinking to fit. I had built something here, not loud, not grand, but steady. The grocer knew my name. The girl at the library saved me the poetry volumes before shelving them. The man at the cafe brought my tea without asking. These weren't people I raised. They weren't people who owed me anything. But in small, consistent ways, they had given me back the parts of myself I thought had dissolved quietly in the corners of a family kitchen. In this town, I was not a relic. I was not a burden, rearranged to suit convenience. I was simply part of the rhythm. I didn't explain my past here. I didn't outline the fracture. I just existed day by day with a kind of dignity I hadn't known I was allowed to want. That winter, I planted lavender in pots along the window ledge. I signed up for a painting class, even though I couldn't draw straight lines. I joined a small group that walked the cliffs every Thursday, trading silence and soup recipes in equal measure. None of it was dramatic. None of it was proof. But all of it was living. When Danica wrote again months later, this time asking gently if I might visit, I placed the letter beside the others. I didn't reply. Not from anger, not from pride, but because the question was already answered. Leaving was never about punishing anyone. It wasn't about proving worth or demanding regret. It was about stopping the slow erosion that happens when you're always giving from a well that isn't refilled. It was about choosing life over legacy, presence over memory. I never went back, but I didn't disappear. I simply stopped standing in rooms where I had to earn my place. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years: myself.